What do you do when the man who holds the keys to your future mocks you for the poverty of your past? How do you reconcile the sheer, white-hot sting of public humiliation with the staggering discovery that the voice that scorned you belongs to the blood that runs through your veins? Was it spite, destiny, or just the cruelest cosmic joke ever played on a 20-year-old kid trying to hold on to a crumbling world? This isn't just a story about revenge, it's a confession. It's about the anatomy of a scandal and the legacy of a fortune hidden behind a life of quiet desperation. This is the truth, behind closed doors. And if you want to know what happens when the pauper becomes the prince, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a thing. Trust me, you'll want to stay for this one. It all started, as the worst things often do, with a spotlight on my flaws. The scene was the hallowed leather-scented lecture hall of the economic department, a place built on the promise of upward mobility. Ironically, a world I could only enter through the narrow gate of a full-ride scholarship. My clothes were threadbare, my shoes scuffed, and my laptop was a decade-old brick that whined louder than a hungry stray. But I was there. I was Ethan, the hungry, bright-eyed kid who saw complex market problems and dared to offer simple, elegant solutions. That day, the solution was less elegant and more disastrous. I was presenting my capstone project on sustainable micro-investing. It was brilliant, I thought. A bootstrap model for people like my mother, Sarah, who lived paycheck to brutal paycheck. I finished with a flourish, the kind of nervous confidence you only find in the desperately ambitious. Then, Professor Alan Sterling, the economic titan, the man whose face was on every college brochure and whose family name was practically forged into the department's crest, leaned back in his Italian leather chair. The chair didn't creak, but the silence did. It was a dense, suffocating silence, the kind that makes you hear your own pulse throbbing in your ears. He didn't just disagree with my figures, he dissected my existence. "An interesting theoretical model, Mr. Ethan," he said, his voice a low, condescending rumble that carried effortlessly across the amphitheater. His eyes, the color of cold steel, were not looking at my slides, but at my cheap cotton shirt. "But it's a model built on sand. It shows me that you've never had to worry about a real bill, a real mortgage, the cold, hard mathematics of true capital. You propose a solution for the poor from the sheltered perspective of someone who only studies poverty. You don't belong in this world, Ethan. You don't understand the stakes. You don't belong in this world." The words weren't a critique. They were a branding iron. They echoed off the polished wood, searing into my 20-year-old soul. I felt the heat rise on my neck, a blush of shame so profound I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. The room blurred. 50 faces, my peers, now judges, all staring at the pauper who dared to dream in a palace. It was a theatrical, unnecessary cruelty, a humiliation so total it felt like a punch to the gut. I managed to nod, to gather my cheap notes, and to walk out of that room with what I hoped looked like professional composure. But inside, I was already constructing the scaffolding of a quiet, furious vow. 2 weeks. Just 14 days after that public evisceration, that monumental takedown, my world fractured and reformed itself with the speed and violence of a lightning strike. My mother, Sarah, the woman who had sacrificed everything, whose hands were permanently rough from cleaning hotel rooms, she collapsed. Stress, exhaustion, the constant grind of survival had finally taken its toll. I was sitting by her bedside, holding her frail, calloused hand, when the letter arrived. It wasn't the usual stack of medical bills. This was thick, heavy linen, embossed with a gold seal from Peterson and Royce, a law firm I knew only from the high society pages of the local paper. My mother, her eyes already clouded with fever and medication, saw the envelope in my hand. Her grip tightened. It was a sudden, almost desperate strength I hadn't seen in years. "The truth, Ethan," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper against the hum of the machines. She pushed the envelope toward me, her face a mask of regret and release. "You have to know the truth. Your father, he isn't gone. He didn't die of a heart attack years ago. And he was Professor Sterling." The name hung in the sterile air, a radioactive particle. Sterling. My mind snapped back to the lecture hall, to the steel-cold eyes, the dismissive wave of his hand. "You don't belong." I opened the envelope, my fingers shaking, the crisp paper crinkling like dry leaves. It wasn't a greeting. It was a testament. A last will and testament. Professor Alan Sterling, dead unexpectedly in a skiing accident 3 days prior. And there it was, in bold, legal black and white. The bulk of his staggering, obscene wealth, a sprawling trust fund built on decades of shrewd investing and old family money, was to be transferred to Sarah, the mother of his child. A fortune large enough, I quickly calculated, to buy not just a seat, but the entire mahogany-paneled economic department, lock, stock, and barrel. The man who told me I was too poor to understand his world had just left my poor mother a fortune to rival his own. The universe, it seemed, was preparing for an epic, brutal counterattack. That word, sterling. It didn't just ring, it shattered. It was the sound of my entire reality collapsing into a heap of expensive, uncomfortable contradictions. Professor Alan Sterling, the man who had dismissed my ambition as a peasant's pipe dream, was my father. The contempt I felt for him, the slow burn of righteous anger, had a foundation of blood and abandonment I hadn't even known existed. I stared at the paperwork, then at my mother's pale, sweat-slicked face. The room was cold, the air thick with the metallic tang of hospital antiseptic, but I felt like I was in a pressure cooker. I wanted to scream. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to march straight back to the university and shove the will under that arrogant department head's nose. But my mother's soft, uneven breathing tethered me. She had been guarding this secret for 20 years. It was a ticking time bomb she had carried, so I could have a scholarship, a semblance of normal life. "Mom," I whispered, squeezing her hand, the paper rattling in my other. "Tell me. Everything." Her eyes fluttered open, dark and exhausted. "Alan, he was different then. Younger. A resident, not a professor. He had fire. We were madly in love. His family, Ethan, old New York money. They saw me, a girl from Queens working 2 jobs, as a parasite. They gave him an ultimatum. The family legacy or me. He chose the legacy." She closed her eyes again, a tear tracking a weary path toward her temple. "He left a check. A big one. I ripped it up. I never wanted his tainted money. I told him he was dead to me. When I found out I was pregnant, I kept it a secret. I wanted you to have my name, my life. He chose the legacy. A familiar story, but hearing it, feeling the depth of her hurt and the tremble of her lips, was like swallowing glass. The irony was a physical weight on my chest. The man who had rejected her for being poor was the same man who later shamed her son for the very same poverty. I ran my free hand over my face, the stubble rough. I had to think. The paperwork, a legal fortress of trusts and clauses, was clear. Professor Sterling, in a final act of what the lawyer's cover letter called atonement, had established a massive ironclad trust, the primary beneficiary being Sarah. The principal, the actual fortune, would only pass to me, Ethan, when I turned 25. Until then, my mother was in charge. Or, should she be incapacitated, which she was, an appointed guardian could manage the assets. I called Peterson and Royce. My mother mumbled, her voice fainter now, drifting in and out of consciousness. Years ago, when I thought I was dying, I told them if anything ever happened to me, they were to tell you the truth. Not a day sooner. I never wanted him to find us. He was too proud. The full weight of the truth settled on me, colder than the hospital air. My father hadn't died years ago. He had lived a few miles away, teaching the lessons of prosperity while his son struggled to afford a decent pair of jeans. He had looked at me, at his own son, and told me I was irrelevant to his world. A simple, uncalculated cruelty, a cosmic joke that only a dead man could truly appreciate. I stood up, stepping away from the bed. I needed air. I needed to move. I needed to see this law firm, to breathe the same rarefied air as the people who had conspired to keep this secret. I have to go, Mom. I have to make sure you're taken care of. I'll be back soon. I took a cab, a splurge I could not afford. But I couldn't drive my ancient car with this seismic shift going on in my head, downtown to the skyscraper where Peterson and Royce resided. The office was all marble and silence, a temple of wealth. I was shown into the office of Mr. Peterson, a man whose suit probably cost more than my entire undergraduate tuition. "Mr. Ethan," he said, his voice measured, professional, yet carrying a hint of genuine regret. "I was expecting you. I apologize for the circumstances." I cut straight to the bone. No small talk. Did he know about me? Did Professor Sterling know I was his son when he humiliated me in front of the entire class? Mr. Peterson sighed, leaning back against the leather of his chair. He was the keeper of the truth. "No, Ethan, he didn't. Not a single soul did, save for me and your mother." Professor Sterling spent the last 2 decades consumed by regret over your mother, Sarah. The trust was established as his penance, a legacy of love he meant for her, believing she was his great lost love. He never knew she was a mother, let alone that you were his student. It is the cruelest of ironies. The realization wasn't a comfort. It was a deeper wound. He hadn't consciously rejected me twice. He had simply been an arrogant, wealthy man who treated every poor student with disdain, his blind spot as large as his fortune. The malice was impersonal, yet the impact was devastatingly personal. I stood there, the law library silence pressing in on me, staring at the panoramic view of the city. A city I was told I didn't belong in, yet a city that now contained my secret, undeniable, and colossal inheritance. The anger hadn't lessened, but it had sharpened. It wasn't simple revenge anymore. It was about rectifying a moral imbalance. It was about turning a sneer into a staggering act of poetic justice. I walked out of that office not as Ethan, the poor, humiliated scholarship kid, but as Ethan, the executor of the Sterling fortune. My mother was too sick to fight, too weak to claim her due. It fell to me, the boy, the professor, never acknowledged, to step into his world, to wear the mantle of his wealth, and to use it as a finely sharpened knife. I looked down at the documents in my hand, my new identity. The revenge wouldn't be loud. It would be an elegant, calculated, and utterly devastating game of misdirection. I wouldn't just belong in his world, I would own it. And no one, especially not his snobbish colleagues, would see it coming. The pawn was about to become the player. Chuang III, Jin Jim, and Vo Oa, the confrontation with the truth. The cab ride back to the hospital felt like traversing a time warp. One minute, I was Ethan, frantic about my mother's medical bills and the shame of my threadbare jacket. The next, I was Ethan, holding the deed to an invisible kingdom, a direct bloodline to the man whose scorn still tasted like ash. The papers, those heavy, intimidating legal pages, felt hot in my hands. The irony was a living, breathing thing inside the taxi's stale air. My father had spent his life lecturing on the principles of capital, yet his final, greatest transaction was an anonymous act of love and remorse that had accidentally placed ultimate power in the hands of the very person he deemed unworthy. Back in the hospital, my mother had drifted into a deeper sleep. She looked small, fragile, a life force dimmed by decades of struggling against the tide. I sat by her side, the white noise of the monitors the only witness to the truth I now carried, a truth too heavy, too complex, to lay upon her weakened heart. I couldn't tell her. Not yet. How could I say, "Mom, the man you loved and hated in equal measure, the man who let his family's pride destroy your happiness, is dead, and his monumental guilt has made us richer than we ever dreamed. Oh, and by the way, he also publicly mocked me for being poor 2 weeks ago, not knowing I was his son. The shock might kill her faster than the illness." So, I kept the silence. It was the deepest, most profound silence I had ever known, the kind that held the weight of 2 lifetimes, my father's regret and my mother's sacrifice. And in that silence, I began to plot. The cruelest of ironies. Mr. Peterson's words echoed in my mind. Professor Sterling's life was an unfinished Greek tragedy. He pushed away the only woman he truly loved, then spent his career teaching economic theory to the son he never recognized, the son he brutally dismissed for lacking real-world financial grit. He had been looking for a way to honor Sarah, to make amends, but had died oblivious to the proximity of his child. I felt a fleeting, bitter pang of something akin to pity, not for the wealth he lost, but for the connection he missed. But the pity quickly curdled into resolve. He said, I didn't belong. He said, I didn't understand the stakes. Fine. I would prove him wrong. I would walk into his world, not as his poor, humiliated student, but as the quiet, sharp-edged heir of his own creation. I didn't want the money for the comfort it could buy. I wanted the power it represented. I wanted to see the faces of the people who worshipped him, his colleagues, his sycophants, when the quiet, forgotten boy they all stepped over suddenly became the man who held the strings. The next morning, I called Mr. Peterson. My voice was calm, measured, devoid of the frantic energy of the scholarship student. It was the voice of a man with a plan. "Mr. Peterson," I said, looking out the hospital window at the world that was suddenly mine. "My mother is incapacitated. I need to assume interim management of the estate assets, specifically the Sterling Trust, until she is stable." A wise move, Ethan. The documents give you that temporary authority, provided your mother is deemed unable to act. I have already secured the necessary medical attestations." He paused, a gentle hesitation. "What is your intention, if I may ask?" "There is a significant amount of liquid capital. I advise caution." "My intention," I said, the word feeling heavy and delicious on my tongue, "is to understand the full scope of Professor Sterling's life and his professional relationships, specifically his involvement with the university's economic department." "Ah," Peterson breathed, clearly catching the scent of my purpose. The professor held a large personal endowment stake in the department. He was highly invested, both financially and emotionally. Uh-huh. A pressure point. "Good," I confirmed. "I need access to all those records. And I need to move quickly, Mr. Peterson. This is not about revenge. It's about control. I am simply securing my mother's investment and correcting a massive social error." I hung up and looked at my reflection in the dark glass. The boy who was shamed was gone. In his place was a colder, more calculated expression. I still wore my worn jeans and faded hoodie, but they felt different now, like a disguise. I was a spy in my own life. I looked at my mother again, her breathing steady, but weak. I leaned in and kissed her forehead. "I'm sorry, Mom, that I can't tell you the truth yet," I whispered. "But I promise you, I'm going to make sure that world, the one that rejected you and tried to crush me, pays its respects. I'm going to play their game, but I'm going to use my father's pieces. He taught me about financial stakes. I'm about to show them what a true high stake looks like." The game had begun. My immediate move was drastic, necessary, and thrilling. I withdrew from the university. I couldn't be a student and the secret heir. The two roles canceled each other out. Ethan, the scholar, was momentarily suspended. Ethan, the player, was activated. I packed my meager belongings, leaving behind the dormitory room that had felt like a gilded cage. I was stepping out of the life of scarcity and into the shadows of opulence. My first target, the very institution that had sheltered my father's pride and fostered my humiliation. It was time to find out just how fragile Professor Sterling's legacy truly was. I didn't just leave the college. I evaporated. No tearful goodbyes to my classmates. No awkward meeting with the dean. Just a cold, hard email to the registrar citing family emergency and health reasons. Ethan, the struggling scholar, was officially off the board. Now began the rigorous, almost monastic phase of my transformation. The first stop was not a luxury car dealership, but a tailor. I needed armor. I needed a disguise that didn't whisper scholarship kid but shouted serious money. I had Mr. Peterson arrange an appointment with a bespoke clothier who charged more for a single jacket than my mother earned in a month. When the tailor, a stern European man named Marcus, raised an eyebrow at my faded attire, I simply handed him the business card of Peterson and Royce. The change in his demeanor was immediate and profound. The contempt dissolved into deference. "I need to look," I instructed Marcus, holding myself straighter than I ever had. Like a man who doesn't need to ask for anything, a man who signs the checks, not one who cashes them. In the meantime, the real work was happening. Mr. Peterson, a man who clearly respected the power of the Sterling name more than the memory of the professor himself, was my reluctant accomplice. He gave me the keys to the kingdom, access to the Sterling Trust's complete financial holdings, including the university's internal investment documents. What I found was shocking. Professor Sterling, for all his pontificating on sound fiscal principles, had been dangerously over-leveraged in the university's endowment, particularly in his beloved economics department. He had used complex derivatives to guarantee certain returns, and with a sudden market downturn combined with his unexpected death, the entire department was teetering on a fiscal cliff. They were desperate. They needed a massive stabilizing investment, and they needed it yesterday. A beautiful, terrifying vulnerability. This wasn't just revenge. It was an open goal. I had the power not only to save the department, but far more deliciously, to dictate the terms of its survival. My first act as the player was subtle. Through Peterson, I began acquiring non-voting equity stakes in the university's holdings, quietly accumulating influence without drawing attention to the identity of the buyer. I was building a stage for my performance. Then came the physical transformation. The new suits were perfect, dark, sharp, and silent. They made me feel less like Ethan and more like an extension of the wealth itself. I cut my hair, traded my worn backpack for a sleek leather briefcase, and, most importantly, I learned to carry the weight of the new money. I trained myself to meet people's gazes without flinching, to use silence as a weapon, and to speak only when my words carried undeniable authority. They are having an emergency meeting of the Board of Regents next Tuesday, Mr. Peterson informed me during a hushed call. The topic is the department's financial implosion. The entire faculty, including the dean, will be present. They are meeting with a potential lifeline, a shell corporation representing an anonymous investor. Cancel the shell corporation, I commanded, my voice flat, almost unrecognizable even to me. I will be the anonymous investor. I want to meet the dean and the faculty alone. Tell them I represent the Sterling Trust. The opportunity was too perfect. I wouldn't just be saving the department. I would be saving the entire legacy of the man who scorned me, a legacy that was, by blood and paper, now mine to control. Tuesday arrived like a judgment day. I walked into the dean's executive conference room, the same room where Professor Sterling's ego had bloomed, wearing my new armor. The silence was immediate and thick. The dean, a nervous man named Dr. Thompson, and a handful of senior faculty members all looked at me with varying degrees of suspicion and desperate hope. I sat down at the head of the long mahogany table, pulling out not a stack of notes, but a single expensive fountain pen. I let the silence hang, heavy and deliberate, the power of my unstated wealth radiating across the room. Gentlemen, I began, my voice low and steady, a new, calculated resonance. My name is Ethan. I represent the Sterling Trust. As you know, the late Professor Sterling had deep, significant investments in this department. Dr. Thompson leaned forward, his face etched with anxiety. Mr. Ethan, we are terribly sorry for your loss. And yes, the professor's investment, it is vital. We are in a precarious position. We need a large influx of capital to stabilize the derivatives, or the consequences will be catastrophic. I steepled my fingers, looking at the assembled faculty, men and women who had consciously or unconsciously witnessed and tolerated Professor Sterling's public cruelty. They did not recognize me. How could they? The nervous, poor student had been replaced by this confident, intimidating figure. I am aware of your position, Dr. Thompson, I continued, maintaining eye contact, deliberately using the language of high-stakes finance that the professor himself would have admired. The trust is prepared to step in. We can stabilize the situation, restructure the debt, and provide an immense multi-year endowment to secure the department's future. A collective sigh of relief filled the room, but I wasn't finished. However, I said, the word cutting through the relief like a shard of ice. The investment comes with a few non-negotiable conditions. The first, a complete overhaul of the scholarship and mentorship program. I want a new fund established, the Sterling Opportunity Fund, dedicated exclusively to low-income, high-potential students. Dr. Thompson frowned. A noble cause, Mr. Ethan. But why the focus? I finally allowed a slow, cold smile, the smile of a predator who has cornered his prey. Let's just say, I replied, my eyes lingering on the empty chair where my father used to sit, that the late Professor Sterling taught me the invaluable lesson that sometimes the student who doesn't belong in this world is the one who ends up funding it. The pawn had just moved across the board, and the king's entire flank was exposed. Chuang Vi, Huan Tatsu Trathu, the sweet vengeance. The board meeting dissolved into stunned compliance. Who were they to argue with the man holding the financial lifeline to their prestigious, yet now deeply compromised department? I had arrived as a ghost and departed as a benefactor, a silent, powerful force, dictating terms in the very halls where I had been publicly eviscerated. The groundwork was laid, the contract was being drafted, but the true climax, the sweet, resonant moment of truth, was yet to come. I returned to the university campus a few days later, not for a lecture, but for a press conference the dean was forced to host, announcing the massive anonymous gift that had saved the economics department. They had wanted to keep the source vague, Kwai Sterling Yinghe, Kove, Ui, Tin Hon La, a 20-year-old dropout. But I insisted on being the public face of the trust representative. I wore my darkest, sharpest suit. My demeanor was ice. I stood backstage, listening to Dr. Thompson deliver a speech dripping with hyperbole about the department's robust future and the visionary generosity of the Sterling Trust. It was a masterpiece of denial, erasing the past 2 weeks of panic and the shadow of Professor Sterling's financial recklessness. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was it. The moment I had been running toward ever since my mother had placed that crumpled envelope in my hand. This wasn't about the money. It was about the ledger of respect. And now, Dr. Thompson concluded, his voice trembling slightly, we would like to introduce the representative of the Sterling Trust, the man who has personally overseen this monumental act of philanthropy, Mr. Ethan. I walked onto the stage, and the cameras flashed. A blizzard of sudden, harsh light. I didn't look at the cameras, nor the reporters. I looked directly at the front row, at the assembled faculty. The same faces, the same polished, privileged people who had sat silently while Professor Sterling had told me I was nothing. I spotted Professor Miles, Sterling's most devoted colleague, and Dr. Anya Sharma, the department's historian. They were smiling politely, a practiced mask of professional gratitude. They did not recognize me. I gripped the podium, my knuckles white. The air was thick with expectation. Thank you, Dean Thompson, I began, my voice amplified by the microphone, carrying an authority I had spent 20 years earning and 2 weeks honing. I am here today to confirm the Sterling Trust's commitment. We are providing a $50 million lifeline to this department, ensuring its future and establishing the Sterling Opportunity Fund. A ripple of applause started, but I silenced it with a sharp, minute gesture of my hand. The quiet was immediate, absolute. The power of the checkbook. I was asked why, I continued, leaning slightly into the microphone, my eyes locking onto the center of the audience, right where my old classmates would have been sitting. Why such a large focused donation? Why the specific emphasis on low-income students? I paused. The moment stretched. I saw a flicker of confusion on Professor Miles's face. He was searching his memory, trying to place the familiar yet utterly transformed figure before him. The answer is simple, gentlemen, I said, my voice dropping to a measured, devastating intensity. This endowment is a final poetic lesson from the late Professor Sterling himself. I took a deep breath. 2 weeks ago, I stood in his lecture hall in front of many of you. I was a student, a scholarship kid with an idea. And Professor Sterling looked at me, the person who stood here today holding his fortune, and he said, "You don't belong in this world. You don't understand the stakes." The air in the room seemed to congeal. Dr. Thompson's mouth fell open. Professor Miles gasped, a small, choked sound. The realization was hitting them, a delayed explosion of recognition and horror. They were staring at Ethan, the pauper, now Ethan, the principal. He was wrong about the stakes, I stated, my gaze sweeping over their paralyzed faces. The stakes are not just financial. The stakes are dignity. The stakes are opportunity. The stakes are allowing talent to thrive, regardless of the brand on your shirt. I placed both hands flat on the podium, leaning in as if sharing a secret only with the camera and the stunned faculty. My name is Ethan. I am the student Professor Sterling publicly humiliated, and yes, by the most brutal of ironies, I am also his son and the sole representative of his estate. The room erupted. The camera flashes became continuous, blinding explosions. Reporters shouted questions. The faculty members looked like statues, carved from shame and disbelief. I raised my hand one last time for silence, the pure, unadulterated power of the moment electrifying. I am funding this department to ensure that no student here, no matter their background, will ever be told again that they don't belong. This money, I announced, gesturing to the signed document on the table, is the professor's true legacy. It is his final, unspoken apology to my mother, Sarah, the woman he left behind, who taught me the real value of hard work. I walked off the stage, leaving the chaos behind me. Later that evening, the noise of the media frenzy, a dull hum outside the hospital room, I sat next to my mother. She was awake, lucid, and watching the local news. A breaking story about the biggest scandal and the largest donation in the university's history. "Mom," I said, taking her hand, "I'm sorry I had to do it that way, but the department, they're saved. And the man who did it was your son." She looked at me, her eyes clear. "You told them the truth?" "All of it. That he was my father. That he left the fortune to you out of remorse. That he didn't know." Sarah smiled, a genuine, beautiful smile that erased decades of pain. "He loved me then," she whispered, tears welling up. "He truly regretted it." The years of bitterness seemed to lift from her shoulders. She was clean. "And you, my Ethan, you didn't seek revenge. You sought justice. You took his money, and you turned it into opportunity. The confrontation wasn't with my father. It was with the world he represented, and I had won. My mother was clean. The debt of humiliation was paid, and the inheritance had been transformed from a symbol of guilt into a promise of equity. The sweet vengeance was complete. Now, only the legacy remained. The aftermath was a hurricane of media attention. They called it the Sterling Redemption, the story of the lost heir who returned from poverty to right his father's wrongs. Reporters camped outside the hospital, desperate for a word with Sarah, the woman at the center of the 20-year-old love story and the $5 million inheritance. I shielded her from all of it. I hired the best nurses, moved her to a quiet private wing, and gave her the one thing she truly needed: peace. During the weeks that followed, my mother's health stabilized, not through some miraculous cure, but through the profound, soul-deep peace that came from knowing her suffering and her son's dignity had been finally validated. She was happy. She had closure on a love she thought was tainted by greed, and she had watched her boy, the one she raised on nothing but grit, become a man of substance and influence. The faculty at the university walked on eggshells around me. They offered stuttered apologies and nervous deference. Professor Miles, the first one to realize the truth at the press conference, approached me in the dean's office, his face gray with remorse. "Ethan," he began, using my name with careful respect. I was there that day. I should have spoken up against Alan's cruelty. I saw the look on your face. I am truly sorry." "You are sorry for the cruelty, Professor, or for the fact that the person you allowed to be shamed now controls the future of your department?" I asked, my voice calm, almost detached. He swallowed hard. "Both, Mr. Ethan. Truly, both. But I want you to know, the Sterling Opportunity Fund is up and running. We have already identified the first cohort of students, bright, hungry, just like you were." I nodded. That was the real victory. Not the humiliation of my father's peers, but the establishment of a foundation that would actively prevent the systemic cruelty that had defined my own entry into that world. I didn't continue my studies immediately. I couldn't. I was too busy learning the difference between passive and active income, between stock options and real estate trusts. I spent months working side by side with Mr. Peterson, not as a client, but as an apprentice. I delved into the intricacies of the Sterling fortune, realizing that the money was simply a tool, a massive, powerful lever to effect real change. Then one quiet morning, my mother, Sarah, passed away in her sleep. She was smiling. She had lived long enough to see her son honored, her sacrifice redeemed, and her old love atoned for. The pain of her loss was immense, but it was cushioned by the profound understanding that she had died a rich woman, not in capital, but in contentment. I took full control of the Sterling Trust. The first thing I did was rename it the Sarah and Alan Sterling Legacy Fund. It was a fusion of two opposing lives: the hard-won integrity of the poor woman and the vast resources of the wealthy man, all channeled into a single ethical purpose. I didn't become a venture capitalist or a corporate raider. Instead, I established myself as the permanent, benevolent manager of the fund. My purpose was to seek out and empower people who were overlooked, just like my mother and me. The greatest lesson I had learned wasn't from Professor Sterling's textbook. It was from the humiliation he inflicted. 3 years later, I stood on the very stage where he had once delivered his final, scathing critique of my worth. I was there not to announce a grant, but to deliver the commencement address for the new graduating class of the now thriving economics department. I looked down at the sea of eager, nervous faces. Some were dressed in designer clothes. Some, I knew, were in clothes bought on a desperate clearance sale, just like mine once were. Professor Sterling taught me a valuable lesson that day, I told them, my voice resonating with years of hard-won wisdom. He taught me that money is power. It is access. It is the ability to walk into any room and command attention. But I learned a more important lesson, one that he died too proud to understand. I paused, letting the silence build, a familiar, intentional rhetorical trick. True legacy is not the wealth you accumulate, I concluded, looking specifically at the young, anxious faces in the crowd. It is the second chance you grant to those who never got a first. It's the opportunity you create for the next generation of students who look just like the person you once shamed. I never became a billionaire. I became a distributor of justice. The humiliation I faced led me to a truth my father never discovered, that the greatest wealth is not what you keep, but what you give away. Now, that's the end of my confession. The full, unvarnished story of the pauper who became the player and the father who died ignorant of his own redemption. If you were me, and you held the power to publicly unmask the arrogant man who crushed your spirit, even knowing he was your father, would you have kept the secret to save your mother's peace, or exposed the truth instantly? Let me know what you would have done in the comments below. Drop a like if you believe that sometimes the sweetest revenge is turning pain into purpose. And don't forget to share this story so others can understand what really goes on behind closed doors.